Hi everyone, and welcome and thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'm Tasneem, so just to introduce myself first, I'm an Associate Partner here at Albany Beck. I look after our Pioneer Technology Programme, and this year we actually launched a D&I series where we interview very special guests such as yourself, Yassmin. So today is really very much kind of focused on Black History Month. And I can't wait to delve into that conversation with you. But first, I'm going to attempt to introduce you to our audience. It's a very impressive and long bio, so I'm really sorry if I get any of it wrong.
All good.
And I will actually read it out from the paper because it was very hard to memorize. So here goes. So, first of all, Yassmin, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I guess to introduce you to our audience, so you're a Sudanese Australian writer, broadcaster, and social activist, advocate. Either's fine. You also come from a mechanical engineering background, which is great. Do a lot of stuff in technology here.
We love engineering.
And also, you were one of the 2020 LinkedIn change makers. You advocate globally on issues of social justice, focusing on the intersectionality of race, gender, and faith. You travel to over 24 countries, speaking to governments, civil society, and corporates on inclusive leadership, tackling bias, and achieving long-lasting change. You also have an incredible TED Talk called What Does My Headscarf Mean to You?, which I've watched and reshared many times. But it has also been viewed by over 2.3 million people and was chosen as one of TED's top 10 ideas of 2015. We're not done. Where was I? You are leading global conversations about being a young Black Muslim woman in the West today. You're also an author of Yassmin's Story and You Must Be Layla. And your social commentary has appeared in Time Magazine, The Guardian, Teen Vogue, The Independent, Huffington Post, and London's Evening Standard, to name a few. And your essays have been published in bestsellers like It's Not About the Burqa and The New Daughters of Africa. You have also set up a few organizations focused on social justice, and currently you sit as a non-exec member on the board of the British Library.
Of the London
Library.
The
correction.
London Library everyone thinks it's the British Library. We're cooler. We're definitely cooler.
The London Library, sorry.
It's all good.
So anyway, I think it's fair to say that you are an expert on this topic.
Thank you. There's nothing more awkward than having your bio read out to you, so I appreciate very seamlessly. Thank you.
No, but I also just needed to we've got, I think the mix of people who are watching this webinar at the moment are some of our consultants, our internal staff, but also a lot of people who are in leadership positions as well. And I just always like them to know who they're speaking to because I think you're wonderful.
Thank you so much.
So I think we'll start with the first question.
Sure.
Yeah,
let's get into it.
You're here today to talk about Black History Month. And I would probably say for the last 5 years or so, I've seen a lot of organizations talk about Black history, celebrate it in the workplace. But what is it? And why is it so important? I think let's start that.
So Black History Month in the UK probably has existed since for about 30 plus years, so just over 30 years, and actually came off the back of Black History Month in the United States. So Black History Month in the United States is actually celebrated in February, and it was set up, it's got a longer history of, celebrating, it used to be called Negro Week and so on. So it was all about, off the back of the civil rights movement in the United States, an opportunity to celebrate the contribution of Black people in the United States. And actually a member, I think, from the Greater London Council visited the US in 78 or 87 and was like, oh, this is great. We should definitely bring this Black History Month business to the UK. And so I think 87 was the first year it was celebrated in the UK. And they chose October. It isn't 100% clear why they chose October. Some say because it's, the beginning of the school year and so on, it was chosen. But the idea really is it's an opportunity to focus on Black people in the UK, the contributions of Black people, but also raise awareness, I think, about racial injustice and so on. And you can kind of see in the last sort of, as you say, the last few years, there has been a shift, especially, I think, last year in 2020 with the resurgence, with the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement around the world. It was really seen as an opportunity to sort of focus in on, what are the contributions of Black people in the UK? How can we solve or improve things around racial justice in the UK? And some people might say, well, why do we need one particular month? I think, like anything, when you're trying to improve, it always helps to have like a focus point, right? You can't detox all the time, for example, you detox for a short period of time, and that hopefully like resets things and helps you improve. Like in the Muslim context, we have Ramadan, which is like a month of fasting, which is a focus month to think about your relationship with your faith, but also detox your body and so on. You can't do Ramadan all the time. It would be ridiculous. So similarly, I think my philosophy around this is Black History Month is a time for us to like really focus in on what are we doing around racial justice personally, in the companies, in our communities. How can we like spend this time to like deep dive, learn a little bit more, and then what habits and so on can we create in this month to hopefully then continue throughout the year.
Thank you for that. And that actually makes a lot of sense. And what I would say is, we were all there, BLM, marching through the streets of London last year. I think there has been a shift from companies kind of celebrating Black History Month and featuring all its Black employees on the brochures.
The one
person many times, yes. I've seen the podcast as well of HR Sally. I don't know if you've seen it, but that cracks me up all the time. So I've seen a lot of that, or maybe just showcasing movies, etc., which I think is great to celebrate Black History Month. But I think what I saw BLM do was change the shift and the focus from only celebrating Black History Month, and rightly so, demanding more from corporations and people in leadership. Have you seen much of a change since then? Positive, negative, a bit of both?
It's so interesting about the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd last year was that, for me, the most significant change was actually the power that Black employees felt within companies to speak out. So I feel like a number of Black people that I know personally felt more emboldened or more empowered, or kind of felt like, if we can't speak about things now in this company, when are we going to be able to speak about them? So as much as there has been a shift, I think, from corporations, that's been driven by the fact that Black people within companies have been saying enough's enough, have been sort of saying, if you actually say you care about me as an employee, you have to care about all of me. Like, what are we doing? What are our policies? How are we discussing this? How do we hold our leaders to account, and so on? And I think that's really interesting because, by and large, I think employers have been used to Black employees not saying very much. Black employees sort of putting head down, quietly maybe muttering to each other in the corridors, but not really making much of a fuss. But I think the confluence of, COVID, the protests out in the street, but also the fact that people were like sitting at home quite often, spending a lot of time online, quite often having conversations online and seeing things. And really it was just like a meeting. There's so many things that have to happen at the same time for real change. If we look at the difference between June 2020 and October 2021, you could say that there's been a lot of talk and no action. You could also say that the kind of actions that people are pushing for are not things that can only happen in a year. So I'm personally a wait and see kind of gal. I'm like, all right, everyone, they put out their objectives, they put out what they're going to do, what they're going to do differently. Let's see how much in 5 years, in 10 years, what will the impact of 2020 have been. I know that a lot of people, especially folks in leadership positions, were really kind of shook. They were a bit frightened. They were like, "What? We don't really know how to deal with all our employees speaking up all of a sudden. We don't know how to deal with this pressure to all of a sudden be racial justice organizations. That's not what we do. We're businesses, right? Like we like bring talent into companies. We, I don't know, build software, whatever it is that they do. They're like, wait a minute, this is not our job. We're a magazine, whatever. And I think I personally have had a number of fascinating conversations with leaders because this has been as much for them a corporate change as it has been a personal change and a personal challenge. And
learning journey.
Right. And like, oh, do I have any Black people in my life? Like, I'm sorry, man, but you can't tell me about the nanny. Like, that doesn't count.
Oh my God.
You know,
Yeah.
like, I love that for you, but no.
Yeah, no. I actually experienced some of that as well in terms of leaders not knowing what to say or what to do. I think the reason why some of them have potentially come to me for is because I was vocal about going to the BLM protests. But yeah, it's interesting because there's been like a massive learning curve, I think, for corporates, but also led by Black employees as well. It's important to also acknowledge as well what I saw during 2020 is a lot of labor and a lot of efforts were put in. And yes, we were centering Black voices, which is amazing and long overdue and should have been a long time. But I also felt there was an imbalance in the sense of putting all the onus on Black people to do all the work. What are your thoughts on that?
Gosh. So I think that lots of different individuals have a different approach to this sort of thing. I think the challenge for people who are within a company, a Black employee within a company, say, for example, in a junior position, people all of a sudden, they kind of, a lot of them found themselves in positions where now they were educating, often senior people, on racial justice issues, which in fact they might not be experts on, right? Lived experience is very important, and it's vital that we put lived experience at the heart of, all of our racial justice work. But simply because somebody is Black, it does not make them an expert in like the realm of racial justice, the realm of anti-racism, and so on. And so I personally know of many instances where people were put into positions of being educators, of being organizers, of being change makers within a company, quite often without being paid any extra. Quite often all of a sudden being put under the spotlight, and everybody in the company is now looking at them and being like, solve our solve our racism problem for us. And this person's like, I'm literally just the administration assistant or whatever it is. But also it means that I think the power dynamic shifts in ways that are not very clear. And what often then happens is the individual gets burnt out because they're doing a lot of work on top of their existing job. They're not recognized for a valid thing that they're doing. They're seen as perhaps by their, the senior leadership might think they're doing a great thing, but their actual line manager might think, well, why are you spending all this time doing extracurricular work when you're not, when I think you should be focused on the deliverables, the deliverables or the KPIs that I've set you. And so that it shifts kind of in a challenging way. And I know that a lot of these, especially, again, junior employees are keen to make change because they're like, I want my company to be better. I want things to improve. But just like, if you're wanting to improve your safety record, you bring somebody who's like an expert in that space. You have to invest resources, human resources and financial resources, to change things in the, the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, or the racial justice space, if you're taking it seriously. It cannot just be somebody who has lived experience's job. As I often, the kind of an academic way to present it would be like, lived experience puts you in the position to know, but in order to convert that into knowledge and into strategy, into so on, there's a lot of extra work that is required. And we have to treat that extra work and extra labor and so on with the respect that it deserves.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And just on that, actually, can you tell us a bit more about, I have the privilege of sitting in a position where I see the recruitment market as a whole. And we hire people all year round, and we have a process for how we do that as well. And just having come from a recruitment background myself, I see a lot of the processes that were put in place that I think just have exacerbated the lack of representation, quite frankly. So I just want to perhaps kind of talk to you about why there is a lack of diversity and Black representation. I have my opinions, but I'm really interested about hearing yours. And also, is it unconscious bias or is it more than that?
Right. So I'm going to do, if you'll allow me, a little bit of background.
You're allowed to say whatever you want to do and say. Absolutely.
So a couple of things are useful to know, I think, when it comes to thinking about, you know, the racial dynamic of a workforce or, you know, of the UK, for example. And one of them is to understand like where the concept of race comes from. Because people listening might have heard the idea that like race is not a biological thing, it's a social construct. But what does that actually mean? If we cast our minds back to, you know, the 1600s, the 17th century. So in 1661, the Brits put together something called the Barbados Slave Codes. And essentially the point of the Barbados Slave Codes, which was in Barbados, was they wanted to find a way to control some of the, like, there was a bit of, they had a bunch of people who were enslaved and so on, but they started to organize against the, you know, the elites and the slave owners and so on. And so the slave codes essentially said, if you're considered white, you are considered somebody who is an indentured servant. And if you are considered Black, you are considered property. So you don't have the kind of same human rights as somebody who is considered human. You only have the rights of like a table or cattle, right? Like it's not, you are put in a completely different category. And the thing is, the conception of white and Black hadn't existed before. So when they created these slave codes, they had to tell people, oh, you are considered white, you're in the category of white, and oh, you over there, you're considered Black because you're in the category. And so that legal framework set up the idea for who gets to be considered Black and who gets to be considered white. And one of the side effects, I think, of this, which is really interesting, is it also broke the back of the union, of the solidarity and coalition building that was happening, because there were like Irish workers and a number of other, you know, white workers or people who were indentured, and they were starting to work together with people we would now consider Black to, you know, fight against their owners. But all of a sudden, they had now created a hierarchy where like some people had slightly more rights than the others and so on. And so by understanding that the concept of white and Black actually came from wanting to make more money off the back of slavery, then we can understand that the concept of race is just, in my view, about, you know, about economics. And we've turned it into something completely different. Right, so if you think that's where it started, let's fast forward to like where we are today. An easy way to think about how racism, or the way that I like to think about how racism is structured, is there are like 4 different hierarchies. Number one is like the internalized stuff, right? So the internalized stuff comes from us absorbing all of the ideas around what it means to be Black, what it means to be white, what it means to be, you know, any other type of race. And again, sometimes we say Asian is a race, but Asian is also an ethnicity, and it's also a literal, Asia is a continent, right? So again, it shows how like loose these categories are. But the ideas that we absorb about what it means to be Black, like when we think what it means to be Black, what are the pictures that come to mind? What are the behaviors that come to mind? If somebody says to me, oh, that's a bit Black of you, what do they mean by that, right? But also, what do we absorb as children, as we grow up? When we think of the idea of a leader, who is the kind of person we think in our mind? Do we think of somebody who is white and wearing a business suit? Or do we think of somebody, you know, who is wearing kente cloth? Or do we think of a woman wearing a turban? Like, who is the idea of a leader that we have? And when we absorb all these things, not only does that affect, you know, and this is kind of around the bias stuff a little bit as well, not only does that affect how we interact with other people, but it affects the choices that we make as well. If I'm a young Black kid growing up, you know, somewhere in London, and the only examples of, you know, Black people that I see are in particular, you know, they're musicians or they're sports people or they're this or they're this, am I going to internalize the idea that those are the kinds of things that I can do, and actually maybe working in the city is not for me? You know, am I going to choose to study economics and classics, or am I going to choose to, you know, go down a different route because I've internalized an idea of what Black people are meant to do? And what are the examples my teachers are going to give me? Are my teachers going to encourage me to study Latin, or are they going to encourage me to do sport? You know, these are all the ways that from a very early age, the internalized stuff impacts our choices. And then there's the interpersonal, right? So there's the internalized stuff in us. The interpersonal is just between you and me, right? The way that we treat each other. And that's what people most often think about when they think about racism. They're like, well, I haven't said anything, bad, or I'm not racist because I haven't yelled at anyone in the street or whatever. And I think part of this is about the education. When we educate people about racism, we tell them, don't be mean to someone because of their skin color. And if somebody thinks that they haven't actively been mean and they haven't said a racial slur, they think that's it, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Of course, have a conversation with any Black person in a safe environment and they'll be like, it's not just about using racial slurs or not using racial slurs, but it's also, what might be termed as microaggressions.
Yeah.
A great example, a way to manifest this, I think, is somebody saying something like, oh, you're really articulate for, someone who looks like you or whatever it might be, or I really love you, or your hair changes all the time, whatever it might be, right? It's a comment perhaps that feels like a poke in the arm, right? And getting poked in the arm once is fine, whatever. If you get poked in the arm, for an hour, it starts to get a bit annoying. But if you get poked in the arm every day for your entire life, you might actually start to lose your mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right? And I think that's kind of the way to think about these things. It's you might, as an individual who is saying these things, might not realize it, but you're adding every comment, every action, every time you get, you pass over, you don't give someone a promotion because you think they're maybe not ready or something like that. These things are all examples of interpersonal racisms that may not feel and have looked different from the stuff in the 70s, but still have the same cumulative impact. I'll be really quick with the rest. So that's
you don't have to. We've got time.
We've got time.
We've got time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've got the internalized inside me, the interpersonal between you and me.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the institutional, right? And this is
my favorite topic.
Right. This is all the rules and the policies and the way that we think about things that are baked in our systems, that are baked in our education systems, in our businesses, so on and so on and so on, that mean that even if I work really hard, even if I absorb all of the comments that come my way and I get passed up for the promotions, but I keep working hard and I believe in myself despite all the messages that the world gives me, I will hit an institutional block. And an institutional block is I think the way that all of the history that I talked about, which is, the fact that, for example, Blackness comes from a legal standpoint,
framework,
a legal framework, exactly. If you
to make more money,
it's essentially
about it's infuriating,
right,
but
it is,
it's a made-up construct,
And folks academics will talk about the idea of racial capitalism because they talk about the idea of race not really existing without the idea of capitalism, because that's really what it was about. How do we make more money? The way that all this sort of comes together and the way that it then gets baked into laws and so on, even though we might not be using the language of Black people cannot be hired here, or Black people cannot enter, this particular university, whatever. We're not using language that's blunt. But this is also Britain, folks. Nobody ever says what they mean, right? So I didn't grow up here, and I got here, and I was like,
I love hearing you talk about that though, because I'm surrounded by a lot. Sometimes I'm surrounded by a lot of people who are all for social justice, but they've grown up in this country.
Yeah.
But you haven't, and so kind of hearing your opinion on how British people kind of communicate it's always interesting.
It's a very polite form. I mean, the Brits essentially invented the way that we understand race, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world. The Brits had the biggest empire. They are expert at creating divisions and divides and systems and policies that don't seem to be doing what they're actually doing. And so when we talk about institutional racism, we can talk about the thing, for example, the fact that before the empire collapsed, essentially, when if you were in a colony,
Yeah.
you were considered like a subject of the British Empire. And then when Brits started to realize, like white Brits started to realize that, you know, the people from the colonies were actually going to come to the UK,
Yeah.
to come to actually stay in England, they started to change the requirements. So it would be, oh, you have to be able to speak English in this particular way, or you have to, you know, pass a European language test, or you have to do all these things that were like subtly, like it wasn't, there was enough plausible deniability to be like, oh, we're not discriminating against anyone here. But actually, if you're going to require someone to know 3 European languages, that probably means that somebody from Kenya or India isn't necessarily going to be able to enter the country, right? And so it's things like this, and there are many, many examples, but ways that laws and rules and so on are set up to make it incredibly difficult for people. Another example is companies that only hire from Oxbridge, right? Which I didn't even realize was a thing until I got here, right? Until I got to the UK.
So I wanted to talk to you about that because on the institutional side, particularly what I'm really interested in, 2 things, because I know you've got some lived experience with that as well as expertise in that field. One of them is promoting on board level. I'm particularly interested in hearing kind of your experience of sitting on a board, how that came about, but also the LinkedIn change makers experience that you had, because I think they're 2 kind of concrete examples of how that led to you sitting on boards. And then from a junior perspective, and this is something that so for example, with our graduate program, scrapped the whole Oxbridge thing because it just doesn't make sense. Because when you're talking about educational institutions, they are also inherently they are constructs of keeping certain people in positions of power, and certain people are not.
Right.
So,
and I mean, like, just to put it in plain language, if you're only hiring from Oxbridge, you're only going to get the like level of diversity that's in those places, right? The level of diversity in those places, they have a diversity problem and they admit it, right? But if you think, why does that happen? Okay, they only really accept particular grades from particular schools and so on. Who can afford to go to those particular schools? Who can access the kind of education that is required to even get into and so when you work backwards, you're like, oh, this stuff is baked in, right?
You can do everything right.
You can do everything right, but if nobody in your school has ever gotten into Oxford, what are the chances? There might be a small chance, but it's very different to going to like Westminster, for example, when loads of people go all the time and they actually prep you while you're at school to be able to get into those places. But let's put that aside for now. I like talking about the ways that I've been able to like gain access to spaces, because I've definitely, so by way of explanation, I was born in Sudan and my family moved to Australia when I was about 1.5 years. I was, fat, chubby baby. Afro, walked around. Adorable.
I've seen them.
And my parents, they grew up understanding the system in Sudan, but, classic kind of like migrants were really like, we're going to hustle and every opportunity we can, we're going to take. And, both of them had to retrain completely. My dad had a PhD in engineering. My mum was a working architect, and they completely had to start from scratch in Australia. But they gave me a real desire and work ethic. Like, from their point of view, they didn't want to tell me about the difficulties of the work. Their position was, we're going to say that you can do everything you can. And so I truly, really believed it. And when I was about 16, I started a youth organization because I was like, there's no one here helping us. So like, how do we help ourselves? Very cute and earnest. And there was a small article about me in our local paper. And it just so happened that around the same time, the Queensland Museum, which is like, our state museum, was looking around for some board members. They had 1 or 2 new vacancies. And, like with any museum, they have their traditional list of the people, the circuit of like cultural institutions that they just pick people from. But one of the individuals on this particular board had read about me in the paper and was like, this young 16-year-old hijabi girl looks quite precocious from the suburbs of Brisbane. Like, why don't we invite her? And genuinely, I think, like, I heard about this later on. Everyone else on the board was like, Are you being ridiculous? This is ridiculous. Like, who is this? Does she even like museums? But for whatever reason, Barbara decided to, fight my case, and they invited me onto the board of the museum. And it was very funny because I remember getting the email from them, and I was like, I had no idea I was like, what? And I said to my mum, oh, Mama, how funny. Like, the Queensland Museum invited me to be on their board, lol. And she was like, take it, go. I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do?
School.
Yeah. She's like, no. She's like, you don't understand. This is a great opportunity. Yeah. And I ended up being, I joined the board, but also it started my governance career. I joined, the design council. If it wasn't for that, I would never have met the first person who gave me the opportunity to write, and it essentially started my writing career. But the important thing about that experience, I remember a couple of months in, my mum asked me how things were going. And I was like, Mama, it's really tough. Like, I'm trying really hard to sound like everybody else on this board, but it's really difficult. And she was like, Yassmin, they did not hire you to be a bad version of a 50-year-old man, right? Like, they want you to be you. So just be yourself in these spaces. And it kind of gave me, and I ended up kind of being this, a little bit of a loose cannon, but a useful loose cannon in the sense that, we would get board papers and I'd be like, well, I know we've been talking about this decision for 3 months and I can't understand why we haven't made it because I thought we all agreed. And, it would be the one thing that nobody actually wants to say. They're like, well, thank you, Yassmin. Actually, that's a very good point. I'm like, can we, and so
can we just go
by bringing, my true self to these spaces, I was able to actually add that diversity that they were kind of looking for. But also, I use it as an example because it's such a powerful case of what difference one person can make on a board, right? If Barbara hadn't decided to push for me,
it's a sponsorship
to sponsor me, exactly, it would never have happened.
So you have to consciously think of how to make yourself diverse.
And there are so many people who are watching, I can guarantee you, who are in positions where they can do that, where you can be like, I see something in someone, and we like to see ourselves in the people that we help sometimes. We like to be like, oh, we went to the same school, we like the same sport, whatever. But if we only go for the people who we share lives and experiences with, we will stay in the same circles that have always existed. But if you sort of cast your eyes slightly further and be like, where can I see potential where maybe I wouldn't usually look? And honestly, 1 or 2 opportunities that you give them can genuinely change their lives. Like, I am here because of the chance that 1 or 2 people took on me. And I think that's an incredibly important and powerful thing for folks to take away.
And I think it's acknowledging their privilege and making space. So you did everything that you can. You're wonderful. So of course you're going to be seen. But it's the whole point. It's like there is so much talent out there. The talent exists. It might not look how you are used to it looking, but it exists. So it's about acknowledging that you are in a position of privilege, especially if you're a white man or a white woman, even in a position of leadership, and saying, look, I have privilege. I'm going to use that to make space. And it doesn't necessarily mean, oh, well, I'm just going to step aside and do nothing, which I think people like to think of extremes, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's that, but also just thinking it's okay to feel a little uncomfortable.
Totally.
Because when you don't hire someone that is
and I mean, I have this experience. So one thing I will say is I don't use the language of privilege a lot, but when I do use it, I say it's a renewable resource, right? It's not going to run out if you use it, right? If you use the kind of gifts and platform and spaces that you have, it's not going to get any lesser because you've used it to help other people. In fact, it will probably only, I think it might change shape or it might look a bit different, but at the end of the day, I'm going to interrupt myself by saying that what we're talking about now is changing things for individuals. And that is slightly different to if you're in a position to changing the structures and so on, and the institutions and the way that you hire and so on. And I know that's something that you're doing here, Tasneem, at Albany Beck. You're setting things up that not only help individual people, but also change the way that you're actually hiring, or you're actually bringing people in, or you're actually training folks. And so I think that you can kind of do both at the same time.
100%.
you can change the lives of individuals, but you can also amplify the way that you're doing that work by, slowly getting used to that discomfort.
Yeah.
And being like, it's in that discomfort, that's where growth is.
Yeah.
Like, that is how you get better. And I think it is definitely a little frightening. I've certainly been in positions, especially, when I'm dealing with like areas of disadvantage or marginalization that I myself do not have lived experience of. I'm like, I'm probably going to get things wrong. You will get things wrong. It's fine if you get things wrong. The problem is not to make a mistake. The problem is what you do after that.
And I feel like actually I get that as well, because I'm very white passing, but I am technically a person of color, do come from marginalized communities, and I do a lot of stuff on this. And I do often get kind of people asking me questions because they don't know, but I'm like, I can only speak on behalf of my marginalized community. I really can't speak for all, but it's important to realize that everyone, regardless of whether they're white or not, are not going to get it right. And that's okay. It's about questioning the environment. And just one thing because I appreciate, we've got good 5 minutes before. That's fine. That's good. Because you touched on kind of people and questioning the companies that they want to work for, etc. And I think this is actually particularly for large corporations, and I would love to get your take on this. They're too scared. Some of them are too scared to move away from what they've been doing. It's kind of safer to just rely on a system. Exactly, on a system. It's like, I'm going to get a well educated graduate that's going to come in and go up the ranks, and it just, But the younger generation, they really care about what the company is doing on that front.
Yeah.
So what would be your message today for the leaders and CTOs and, because it's kind of hard sometimes to bring that point home.
Yeah. So my personal view is that there is this opportunity now for you to figure out how to do this well, and so that you are the place that people come to. Okay. Because I think everyone can understand right now that corporates are in some ways struggling with the changes that are happening and responding to the way that society is shifting and so on. But I would say, in the same way that you have like a risk tolerance for other parts of your business, and you have strategies for how to deal with that risk and how to mitigate the risk and so on, I would say do the work to learn how to do this better, essentially, and to think about, ultimately, if you're in the business of talent, you want to be able to attract the best talent there is. And the best talent there is right now is thinking about this, is thinking about, what are the ethical values and positions of this company? And it's important to understand, people are not looking for outcomes. No. They're not saying, are you the perfect business? They're saying, are you even trying?
Yeah.
Do you even have a policy? Do you even have a system? If something happens in your company, what is the process for figuring things out? What is the process for holding people accountable? If you don't have a system, if you don't have a process, if you haven't even thought about it because you're a little too frightened, that says to me, you're not a company that knows how to deal with change. And that says to me, you're not a company that knows how to deal with me, right? And I have left companies in the past. I used to, work for big oil and gas companies, not famously, they're not known for dealing well with change, right? And I'm like, I want to be my fullest self for you. I want to do but they were unable. They didn't have the flexibility to deal with the whole of me, right? And it's not to say that I didn't try, but it was the fear stopped them from seeing the opportunity.
Yeah.
And I would say, grab a hold of that fear, understand that, yes, it's very valid, but you have an enormous opportunity to be the company that the best of the best come to. Because there is huge pools of talent that are completely untapped, that are looking for where to go right now.
Yeah.
Okay. And if a company says to them, not only will we support, the technical talent that you bring, but we're going to support you, that's a pretty great place to be.
Yeah. And I think on that, because I'd like to move to the Q&As as well, because just on your point, there are some really interesting questions that have come through. Culture fit. Well, just to close it with that point,
sure.
because you said something great in our brief before we did.
So when I work with companies sort of around the world, one of the things I often end with is like, rather than thinking about culture fit, think about culture add. Rather than thinking about how do I change this person to how do I squeeze this person into the mold that we already have in this company? Hey, actually, what can this person bring to our organization that's new and a bit different? How can they, and a beautiful small example I'll give is I did some work for a company where I said to them, hey, look, it was workshops during the day. And I was like, hey, look, I'm just going to take, 5 minutes in the middle of the day to go and pray. Like, that's my thing. And this is usually an awkward moment because it's like, yes, I am a Muslim. And it's a moment where I have my identity, is at the forefront of the conversation. I'm like, it's fine, guys. But to this leader's credit, they were like, oh, that's no worries. Well, then when you go off and pray, why don't we all take 5 minutes? If you want someone to do some meditation, whatever, this is an opportunity for us to all kind of like take a moment and reset. And it went from being, oh, this is something where we might have to force you to fit differently to, oh, how can we
learn from it?
Right? Similarly, I used to run a social club at one of the corporates I work for. And, the social club was mostly going out to drink. And I said to the club, I was like, how can we do things differently for people who maybe don't drink alcohol? And we organized like a couple of, I think we had a sailing day and something else. And then a whole bunch of new people joined because they were like, oh, we didn't realize that there was an option outside, the culture fit option that we're all kind of used to. So when you have people that don't necessarily kind of fit that square box perfectly, maybe think, is there something here that we can learn? Is there something that they can add to us rather than forcing them to change?
I love that.
Yay.
Thank you. No and I think, so to make it easier, I've gathered the questions before the session because I've been working from home for a long time. I'm sure you have been as well. So technology outside of the realms of Zoom.
Yeah.
It's a bit tricky. So I would like, because actually I had some questions from anonymous people, but people in leadership positions who wanted to, so I'll start with those first. One of them has said, as a white male in a leadership role, I'm very passionate about D&I and about increasing representation. But how can I promote D&I in the workplace without it coming across disingenuous?
So my thing to you, Mr. White Man in a leadership position, I feel like an agony aunt. That's kind of agony aunt.
Mr. White Man.
Yeah. Mr. White Man in a leadership position. I honestly, so it doesn't matter if it comes across as disingenuous or not. That's my gut reaction. Like, I think your actions will show people whether or not you're actually disingenuous or not. If you are worried about people thinking that you're not for real or not, then make sure it's more walk than talk.
Yeah.
Make sure that I think what folks like me are quite wary of is people using the language of, diversity, equity, and inclusion to make themselves look really good, but never actually do the work, never actually promote the Black person when it comes to it, never actually turn up to the person of color book club that's been organized, or the Ramadan iftar that's been organized, whatever it is, if the person is not showing up, then it's like, well, you don't really care about this. But if in every promotions meeting, you're like, let's think about how do we create an opportunity for someone from a historically marginalized background here. If you've sponsored, 3 or 4 people from a marginalized background, whatever, if your actions are showing that you do care and are reflecting your values, then, people will start to believe what you say. I think it's all about, folks tend to have a pretty good, BS barometer. And again, it's all about what are your actions showing me about the kind of person you actually are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with that. A favorite of mine actually is when I'm sat in a room talking about D&I, et cetera, and it's always like there's one kind of comment that's always made, like, I love your passion, but.
But, right? You're like, but what, sir?
But I'm uncomfortable. Yeah. Which is fine.
You can totally be uncomfortable. It's what you do next. There's actually one really actionable point that there's a study that showed that if you're looking at promotions, for example, and you have 4 candidates, if you have 1 woman on your promotions, on your shortlist versus 2 women on your shortlist, you are 79 times more likely to promote the woman if there are 2 women on your shortlist. And if it's like, this was a US study, a minority, if you have 1, say person of color versus 2 people of color, you are 194 times more likely to pick a person of color. And that's because when you only have 1 person on the shortlist who's from a different group than the norm, then all of your biases, all of your internalized stuff is projected on that 1 person. But if you have 2, you kind of have to look beyond their identity, beyond your biases. And so one thing I always say, especially for people who are in, talent acquisition, balance your shortlists, make sure there is more than 1, because if you are the single person in that pool, you're almost never gonna get get the job.
Yeah. No, I can. Completely agree.
There's one thing you take away: balance your shortlists.
Balance your shortlist. Yeah. I think the talent acquisition. I think our talent acquisition team are this actually, but they are great. They do that anyway.
Awesome, wicked.
Good. This is an interesting question because it's slightly off topic, but it's more to do with you being a guest.
Okay.
What is your biggest achievement to date, Yassmin?
Oh my days, my biggest achievement.
No pressure.
Oh no.
I mean, that was a really long bite. It didn't even cover anything. So.
What am I? Oh my God. I don't think it's my biggest achievement, but something I'm really proud of is I've rebuilt my life a number of times in many different industries and sectors and countries. And that's something that I'm really proud of. When I was in my early 20s, I moved to Perth, a city I didn't know, and started a new job, a new career. When I was 26, I moved to London. I didn't know anyone. I started a new life, new career. This year, I've been in Paris, writing books. I've learned French. I didn't know anyone. And so I think that I'm quite proud of being someone who, has dealt with a lot of things come my way, but every time, for better or for worse, I've been all right, I'm going to get back up and try again. Which, people are always yeah. I'm this is exhausting, but I'm going to do it. And I think that is something I'm really proud of because, it's not always easy. It's not always easy. And also, I think that I've been able to do it. And even though I think I am a cynic, and a terrible, cynical person.
Cynic.
All of my friends are no, I'm not.
If you're a cynic, I don't know what I am.
So the fact that I haven't ended up a bitter, cynical old auntie, I think is an achievement.
We've all ended up aunties.
Yes, it's true.
Cynical.
It's true.
Not cynical. Okay, and so this is. I'm just trying to pick some of the questions. Okay. As a Black young woman, how do I navigate a world where D&I is often talked about, but I often don't feel included?
Firstly, I'm sorry, because it's not easy and it's really annoying. And I think it can be very disheartening when you hear people talk the talk and you don't hear much action. I think if you're in a corporate, you almost have to kind of decide for yourself what path you want to take in the corporate world, right? I, in the end, decided that I much preferred changing the corporate world from the outside, personally, because in order to change from within, you really have to have a particular type of strategy. You have to think about, alliances and this, that, and the other. And I was just,
I can tell you all about
it. I don't have time for that.
For 10 years. Right.
Yeah. So come to Tasneem, she'll tell you. But I think that, you can take the route of putting your head down and just focusing on your work and finding 1 or 2. Okay, let me give you some actions. 1, find a sponsor. If you can so the way that I found my sponsor when I worked in a big corporate was we had this big shot boss come from overseas and give a talk about how much he cared about diversity. I was all right. And then I approached him afterwards and I was interesting talk. I'd love to. I was I actually do some work on this. And I sent him my TED talk, which was a flex, I'm going to admit.
2.3 million views. Yeah. It's a very big flex.
But I was if this is something you really care about, I'd love to see what you think of this. And then he emailed, that was very interesting. I was would you like to, could you be my sponsor? Could you be my mentor? And he went high up in the company. He was high up and went even higher. And he was somebody that like I kind of actively sought out to help me in my career. So I would say that if you're somebody who's in a vulnerable position structurally or systemically, systemically, find one or two sponsors who can kind of vouch for you, who can help nurture your career and so on. Find allies that are peers, right? But don't necessarily expect that your peers will go out of their way, like put their necks out for you, because I think that tends not to happen. I think the people that can protect you from the kind of machinations of the corporate world are going to be people that are much higher than just your line manager or just your peers. But also I would say protect yourself. I would say that watch for what people do rather than what they say. It is not your responsibility to fix the company. If you want to do it, great, but don't feel like you have to. I didn't join any D&I stuff until in the corporates that I worked for, I was like, I'm going to focus on my engineering career. And then when I left, I decided that this was work that I wanted to do and I could use my experience in the companies to do that. But look after yourself and look after your peers who are in similar positions, because, you have each other's back, but it's not going to be easy. But good luck.
Thank you. And then I think we have room for a couple more.
Great.
So what steps can managers take to ensure Black employees are considered for promotions in the same way that their white colleagues are?
Great. So, number one, balance your shortlists, nice and easy. Number two, watch out for the kinds of bias tricks and things that often come into play. So, for example, saying that somebody doesn't have enough experience is something that's often said about people who are from historically marginalized groups, whereas the same experience in a dominant culture person will be, oh, they have a lot of potential. So let's give them this extra responsibility so they can show us out their potential. So think about, are you not putting someone for promotion, or even in the conversation when you're discussing who's going to get promoted, is somebody saying, oh, they don't have enough experience? That's a bit of a flag. Is somebody saying, oh, especially if they're women, oh, we're not sure, are they, did she just get married? Does she want to have a kid? These things we know we're not supposed to. I hope to God those
conversations don't happen anymore. But yeah,
they don't happen, but people honestly think about.
Yeah, I think
right.
So.
Maybe it happens more in the in the sector that I come from, but certainly people are like, is this something that I have to consider? And even if it's just a little thing in the back of their mind, that might tip the scale. So actively make sure that you're preempting these things before. And go to bat for them. If you're in a conversation and you put forward somebody's name and it kind of gets batted away, but you know that they could do that job, go to bat for them. There's no harm for going hard for one of the people that you've got under your wing, because I think if you're not going to do it, who is?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
I think that's a great one to end on.
Great. Yes. Go to bat for your people.
Any last words for people in management, and then any advice for people that are coming through the ranks who are junior?
For people coming through the ranks, I know it feels like it's impossible, but we can both attest to the fact that it's better than it used to be.
Yeah, it is better than
it's better than it used to be. And although it may feel like change is super slow, it is happening. And and we have to continue to push for change to happen, but the change is happening, and that's fantastic for you. So don't feel like things are impossible, because they're not. They are very possible, and you are at the edge of that possibility. So continue to push for things that have never happened before, that things that people may never imagine. And be excited about what's possible, because I think that for the first time, really, certainly in our lifetimes, these conversations are not niche conversations that are happening in the corridors, but they're things that are being platformed, they are being given the space. So even if you think that it might all be talk, take that opportunity and be like,
call it out.
You said it. Yeah. You said it, right? So let's see that back up, right? And for the managers, I get it. There's a lot on your plate. there's a lot of stuff you have to think about. You might be like, racial justice is the last thing that's on my mind. There's a global pandemic and we need to make money. Yeah. I hear you. But remember that you can change the lives of the people that you work with. You actually have the capacity to. The reality is you are already changing the lives of the people around you, whether you realize it or not. The question for you is, what change is that? Is that a positive change? Is that a change that is going to leave the world a better place? Or is it not? And if you think of yourself as somebody who wants to leave the world a slightly better place than the one you came into, you have the opportunity now to do that. And it doesn't even have to be a huge thing. Even if you give one person a good word or you help with one person's promotion, that can be a life-changing impact. So grab that chance and run with it.
Yassmin, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
I really loved having you. Thank you so much.